Welcome back to another episode of the My Latin Life podcast. Since 2014, My Latin Life has been your trusted guide to traveling and living in Latin America. Today, I have a very special guest. His name is Ric Gazarian, and he's the host of his own podcast, the Counting Countries podcast, one that I've actually been listening to for a couple of years now. He's one of the most widely traveled people in world history, probably. And he's interviewed pretty much every other person that's among the most widely traveled people in world history. So I'm going to do my best interviewing this legend, and we're going to have some fun.
Oh, well, thank you for that warm welcome. And I don't know if I would categorize myself as travel legend or even the most traveled, but I do love travel and that's my biggest passion. So glad to be here.
Well, I think what's cool about, when people start taking a look at competitive travel and looking beyond just the 193 countries, but the subregions and the different sort of markers or subcategorization that different organizations do. Nomad Mania has like 1,300 subregions. Different places have different sort of lists. Um, you realize how there is some structure to it. And I think it might be fair. You're probably like within one of the top like 1,000 most traveled people ever or something like that, right?
Yeah. I mean, looking at Nomad Mania, which is a great website and a travel club, which divides the world into 1,301 places. And I mean, I do really enjoy the website and I do look at the list. And I am, give or take, top 600 when you look at people who are trying to travel to all 193 countries in the world. So I'm one of many people who are pursuing this passion of chasing 193 or visiting all 193 countries in the world.
Were you familiar at all with My Latin Life? Because we've had city guides around for like 6, 7, 8 years.
I have to admit I was not, but since you reached out to me, I've been listening to a couple of your podcasts, and I have been checking out your website, which looks like a very strong resource. And I know when I head back to Latin America, I'll be kind of checking in on the site and the city guides, which you guys do have. So
Thanks, man. I really appreciate that. And yeah, I guess for some context for the listeners, I first reached out to Rick maybe a month ago, and I almost want to read what he said. He said, I'm traveling West Africa and moving at a fast pace. The Wi-Fi is not good. And then the next email was like, we had a 14-hour drive yesterday. There's no Wi-Fi or electricity at the hotel, but we'll follow up later on, and then blah, blah, blah. And then so now you're in Bangkok, Thailand, which I believe you've been living, a city where you've been living for a couple of years, probably arguably your main base. Would that be the case?
yeah, so I think it's good that we waited till I left Africa because it was an amazing but pretty challenging 2 months. So yeah, I'm back in my home base, and I've actually been technically here since 2013. And I spend more time here than anywhere else, but it only really works out to about 90 days on any given year. But I own a place here, and I'm sitting at my desk here with my widescreen monitor, and yeah, this is the office and the home base.
Interesting. I almost wanted to bring this up later on, but I guess now that we're on the topic, like, how do you think about the trade-off between traveling and having a home base? For myself, I haven't had an apartment since 2018, so it's been like 3.5 years of just constant travel. And obviously, my grandma wants me to get a home base at some point. I mean, how do you think about the trade-off?
Yeah, I mean it's definitely a trade-off, and there's pros and cons with everything, and you, me, many of the people who are listening have the amazing pro of getting to see the world, having amazing travel experiences, meeting tons of people all over the world. Um, and then the trade off is you don't have that stability in the home base and a 9 to 5 routine, which you can, have some stability in your life. And, that at some levels a detraction as well. So, the path I followed of the last, getting close to 10 years actually, is more of, being on the road and traveling and not being in my quote unquote home in the US. So,
Hmm. And I mentioned the idea of competitive travel to some of my friends here that I'm traveling with, and it elicits funny responses. Everyone kind of smirks a little bit. Most people haven't heard of the term of competitive travel. How would you define it? What is it? And who's into it?
yeah, I'm going to take a step back. So, I consider myself part of the chasing 193 community
Hmm.
slash extreme travel. And these are the individuals who are trying to visit every country in the United Nations. And I think we can break that community into competitive and non-competitive, meaning some people are going to every country in the world, don't have social media, don't have any sort of media presence. And while they're trying to go to every country in the world, it's not competitive for them. They're doing it 100% for themselves. And then I would say on the other side of the coin, it can be a little bit competitive. And what I've noticed is a lot of people are branding themselves. So I'm the
Hmm.
youngest Spaniard. I am the first gay person. I'm the first vegan to travel to every country in the world. Or I'm the fastest or the slowest, or an individual who's not using an airplane and going by land to every country in the world. So we've got all different types in this community. It's not, it's probably several thousand people big. Only about 250 people have accomplished the goal of traveling to every country in the world, but it is diverse. Every corner of the globe, every age category, every sex, every religion, and everybody has their own unique style when they're doing it.
It's true. And I did notice that it actually is a surprisingly diverse community. You'll see people with sort of lower quality passports. You'll see a lot of women. Um, I guess this call of travel, pretty much speaks to everyone in some core way. Rick, I was hoping you could kind of break down the difference between some of the projects that you're involved in. So there's Nomad Mania, there's Counting Countries, there's Travel Massive, and the Extraordinary Travel Festival. And I was hoping you could speak to a little bit to all these things that you're involved in and kind of break them down.
Sure. Yeah, I get my hands in a lot of different pots. It's kind of a mile wide and an inch deep. Um, so I started off, give or take 2014, with my own travel blog, which is Global Gaz, GAZ. And for the last 8 years, I've been writing my travel experiences and sharing my photos. After that, I rolled out my podcast called Counting Countries. These are long format interviews. I interview and speak with the most traveled people in the world, people that have traveled to every country in the world or are in the middle of their quest of pursuing that goal. Travel Massive is I call it the LinkedIn of the travel industry. So if you work in the travel industry, it's a great network to share ideas with and meet people who work in the travel industry across the world. And then you mentioned the Extraordinary Travel Festival. As I said, I'm part of the 193 community. It's it's a great community. It's a really interconnected community where tons of people are helping each other uh, pursue their quest of traveling to every country in the world. So in October of 2022 in Yerevan, Armenia, it's going to be the largest gathering of the most accomplished and avid travelers in the world. meeting up together at that time. So that will be a really cool and interesting event. So
Mhm.
extraordinarytravelfestival.com.
And Nomad Mania is also a website and podcast. And the podcast, I believe, is like shorter form, info driven conversations.
Yeah. So, I mean, to break it down, so I'm trying to go to every country in the world, 193. For some people, that's not enough. They said, the world's bigger, it's more diverse. You need to go visit more places than the 193 countries. So you have Travelers Century Club, which divides the world into 329 places. That travel club's been around since the 1950s. Most travel people founded by Charles Veely. I think that's 891 places. Nomad Mania, which we've mentioned a couple of times, 1,301 regions. I for a while was hosting a podcast for them, and that was sort of more of a travel guide to more off the beaten path places, like going to Svalbard or Mali or something of that nature. So I was just helping out there. I'm a fan of the organization, but I'm not a founder or an official officer of that group or anything of that nature, but just a friend and a partner.
Got it. Definitely a good resource. I can tell you that my favorite podcast episode of Counting Countries that I've listened to um, is the one with Jeff Shea,
Oh,
where his goal was to summit the largest or the highest mountain in every country in Africa, and he did just about all of them. But it was probably one of the best podcasts I've ever listened to in my life. I can remember exactly where I was when I listened to it. I was in Rome, kind of walking around the Colosseum and stuff, and I swear I was more enraptured in the podcast than in Rome itself.
that might be a good testimonial for the podcast. I think but you're actually might be switching up people. So I interviewed one uh, guy from, well, actually both are from California. So I interviewed one guy, Jeff Shea, and Jeff is this amazing, amazing traveler who's done the seven summits, traveling, climbing the highest mountain on each country. And
Hmm.
he's this amazing guy. But you're actually, I think, referring to Francis Tapon, who is equally as incredible in my book. Francis spent 5 years straight in Africa. He bought a truck, drove around the continent for 5 straight years, and summited the highest peak. I think it was 51 out of 54 countries in Africa. So both in my book are amazing interviews and amazing travelers.
Yeah, I think it was the latter then. Um, yeah, I could go into more detail, but yeah, I remember it just being insane. It just sounded so vivid, and it was just such an extraordinary feat, and it just requires so much motivation. And it was all these stories about he's kind of like pulling up to like extremely rural sites in off the beaten path African countries. There's no water. There's no like resources at all. Um, he did some of it with like his wife, some of it with maybe a guide, practically solo. It was insane.
Yeah, I mean Francis Tappan. Check out, just Google his name. He is incredibly hardcore. Um, we both have the same goal of traveling to every country, but I mean, to me, he's in a totally different category. I would never try and duplicate tons of the things that he's done, and I find him to be really an impressive guy, and he's definitely worth following and checking out.
And this actually leads me to sort of a question about motivation, which is maybe starting with yourself. Like, what motivates you to visit every country in the world?
Yeah, I decided I was going to travel to every country in the world in 2008. So it's been a while. I'm making slow progress. I'm at 151 UN countries. And I got laid off in 2008 from my job in financial services. '09, I took a 12-month trip around the world, and I made a little Excel spreadsheet of all the countries I was going to visit. And I said to myself, in a bell jar, I go, I'm just going to visit new countries. I'm going to start with South Korea and just keep on going west and picking off new countries. Um, I did that. I can't remember how many I visited, probably 25 new countries or 2025, a couple of repeats. And my quest was kind of dormant for several years after that. And then I found the community online. So once I realized other people had done this goal and other people were trying to complete it, I found this group every passport stamp. I read this book, Chasing 193, and this was probably 2013, 2014. And that refocused me and remotivated me to pursue and finish that goal.
Okay. And what do you think are some of the commonalities between people that are pursuing this goal in terms of background or personality traits or purpose?
Yeah, as I was kind of pointing to this earlier, it's really a diverse group because it could be a 19-year-old who's starting out on this quest, and there's guys. I mean, one of our speakers at the Extraordinary Travel Festival, she's in her 80s. She just went to the island of Socotra off of Yemen because
Hmm.
that's one of the 329 places on the Traveler's Century Club. Um,
Hmm.
so the motivation, I mean, categorizing the people in the community, I mean, again, it's every sex, it's every religion, it's every country, it's every income group as well. I mean, there's people couch surfing and on $20 a day budgets, and then there's guys chartering airplanes. From a personality standpoint, I think every one of us at some level has a little bit of OCD. You want to create lists, you want to check things off the list. You like planning, you like logistics, you like scheduling. And then at the end of the day, people have a quest for learning, discovery, and exploration. They want to see different corners of the globe and I think see with their own eyes what the real narrative might be. What or the narrative they're hearing from the media or other websites or your friends and going there to discover on your own what's taking place on the ground.
Hmm. I think it's interesting and important that you noted that you really need to be you need to be good at logistics and planning. Have you found that to be the case? It seems like most of the conversation, let's just say in every passport stamp community, is really around logistics and sharing tips about how to get this and that visa, which consulate's issuing them, finding like a fixer or local driver. Um, you know, you, I feel like I'm the best like logistics guy kind of in my friend group, and actually a lot of my Latin life, a lot of the most important information is like where to stay, what neighborhoods, what's the different vibe in different areas of the city, things like that. Um, so maybe you could just speak to logistics for a minute. And are these people just like the most logistically oriented people ever, or?
Well, and I'm going to make up these numbers for my little anecdote I'm going to give you. If you're going to Amsterdam and you go to TripAdvisor, there's 6 million reviews for restaurants, hotels, and museums. So, in other words, all information is known about Amsterdam. But
Mhm.
if you are going to Douala, Cameroon, you go to TripAdvisor, there's 374 reviews. It's something like that. I mean, the dichotomy is humongous. So, with that in mind, you need to get information. You need actionable information if you're planning on visiting Cameroon. And you're not going to get it in your traditional travel resources. So, hence, in this example, every passport stamp is a group of 12,000 people who are trying to visit every country in the world. And there's, as I said before, also, there's a pretty good sense of community, meaning people are willing to share their experiences or advice. So,
Hmm.
back to your point, how do you get the visa? Is it, can you get a visa on arrival? What consulate in or embassy in Africa will issue it the same day? What's the COVID situation now? What's it like crossing by land versus heading to one of the airports?
Hmm.
How to get a guide or a driver. And then the other part is, again, back in Cameroon, it's a giant country. There's a lot to see, but there's not a ton of information on what the highlights are in the country. So, yeah, it's a trading place or an exchange of great ideas and information, which is not readily accessible that you can share with other people who are chasing 193.
Hmm. And so, Rick, what advice would you give to me for my Latin life where, um, we really got popular providing information on these sort of tier B, second tier and third tier cities in Latin America, where, for example, there's a lot of information on Rio, but then there's going to be less information on Vitoria or Belo Horizonte or even smaller cities. And so that's where we've sort of carved a niche to some extent, is providing information for some of these lesser known places. What information would be valuable for you to see in these city guides, in these articles? What do you think people are really out there looking for?
Yeah, I think it's some of the more basics, as you said. Where are you going to stay? What neighborhoods? What area? And then you're going to break it down from hotel to hostel to Airbnb. Where are the good restaurants? What are the good bars? Um, and then what's there to see and do? So yeah, I mean, again, I would argue all information is known on Rio. Everybody knows to go to Sugarloaf. But yeah, the second and the third tier is how do you give information to a short or a long time visitor, uh, which a local would know. I mean, that's what I would want to know if I'm visiting that type of place.
Yeah, local information. Makes sense. And when you're hosting your podcast, I know that you have some sort of stock questions that you like to ask every guest. What are those questions that you always ask?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, if you listen to the podcast, I do work off a template. Um, and some of my interviews are 3 hours long, so you got to be ready to kind of sit back and listen for a while. But it's everything of it's biographical, so I want to know about their family, about growing up, but within a travel perspective, meaning, I don't care what they studied in college, but I want to know what travels and what trips they did in college. And then I want to know how they made the transition from being a traveler or a tourist to someone who is chasing 193. So that's kind of the biographical aspect of my interview. And then after that, it's, favorite countries, least favorite countries, most difficult visa, what counts as visiting a country. So
Hmm.
I think that's everybody in the travel community. If you want to get people arguing and fighting, you ask them what counts as visiting a country. There's no universal governing body which everybody is a part of. So, in other words, at some level, everybody can make up their own rule of what it is to visit a country. So, yeah, so I get a template, I work off the template, and it's a deep dive interview.
Hmm. And what have you noticed in asking that question about how someone goes from a traveler to someone chasing 193? What is that sort of mindset shift that occurs or change in purpose?
Yeah, I always ask it or phrase it or usually phrase it, when did that light bulb, turn on above your head? Because,
Hmm.
someone, maybe you've been to 20 countries or 50 countries, but at some point a light bulb kind of snaps on and you're like, wait a minute, I'm going to go to every country in the world. Some people are kids. There's people I've interviewed who started collecting stamps as a kid,
Mm.
and that transitioned eventually when they got older to traveling to every country in the world. Or someone will tell me even they just simply got a globe and they had this globe in their bedroom, which they spun and rolled around every single night, and they started about dreaming traveling. Um, from a more practical standpoint, I hear a lot of people kind of getting close to 100 countries or getting to 100 countries. And there's that day they might take up the Excel spreadsheet and start typing in all the countries that they've been to. And they're like, oh my God, I've been to 100 countries. How many countries are there in the world? You know what? Maybe I can do this. Other times it's reading a blog. A lot of people have mentioned Gunnar Garfors from Norway as someone that they read online, and that motivated them to chase 193. Um, and then I think the biggest catalyst in the last several years is the visibility of the Chasing 193 community on Instagram and Facebook. So that has been a catalyst, and that's lit the fire for a ton of people to pursue this passion and quest.
Hmm. As well as allowing them to monetize it.
Yeah. But back to your question earlier, competitive travel. And, there's definitely, I don't know what percentage I would say is competitive. There's a slice of the community that's monetizing their travel. In fact, I mean, maybe one of the best examples, I just had my 100th interview. It was with Drew Binksy. He just finished Every Country in the World in November. And that guy, I mean, he's incredibly, incredibly successful. He's got close to 10 million followers across social media. He's got 5 billion views on his videos. And he has, I would call it a small, mid sized media company creating video travel content, and
Hmm.
he's one of the most successful members of the 193 community. Has been able to monetize his travels.
Hmm. Is there, and I'm just guessing here, but is there any sort of tension between maybe like the old guard of low key travelers and the new sort of Instagram friendly monetizing travelers?
um, I would say in some cases yes. So um, and it doesn't even have to be old school, new school. I would say it's just maybe old school mentality versus newer school mentality. So I was just talking with a friend of mine, a fellow traveler who is top 20 on Nomad Mania. And, he is a very, very deep, deep traveler. I mean, he's getting deep into some of these countries in terms of travel and experiences. And, he was criticizing some of the travelers who might be considered more of checking a box. So, in other words, they
Hmm.
might plan a trip and do 7 countries in 2 weeks. Um, Meaning, doing the math, being generous, that's 48 hours a country. And many of the old school thinkers, old school travelers might go in the community or to their friends or whatnot saying, what are those people really seeing? They're just doing it for their ego and checking off the box. So yeah, I mean, whether it's tension or lighthearted debates, there's definitely two schools of thoughts when it
Hmm.
comes to, let's say, deep travel versus checking the box.
And by the way, congrats on the episode 100 with Drew. I
Mm.
was listening to a bit of it to kind of prepare for this conversation.
Oh,
So,
cool.
not, hitting 100 podcast episodes is quite a milestone. So, everyone, of course, go check out the Counting Countries podcast. And speaking to deep travel, one of my other favorite podcast episodes of yours that I listen to hopefully I don't get this one wrong too. That would be embarrassing, but would be with Jorge Sanchez,
Mm.
who is a Spanish guy, I believe, living in Russia now. And he has traveled to whatever, more or less every country in the world. But not just that, he's done a lot of the subregions, and he did it without a lot of money. He did it on kind of like that kind of volunteer in the hostel type vibe, getting by on a couple dollars a day, living with like native tribes and stuff, not really relying on internet. I bet he has a very old phone. And I'm like, this guy's like the old school generation for sure.
Yeah, Jorge Sanchez is a travel legend. He's a Spaniard, as he said. If you look at Nomad Mania, which is just an awesome rabbit hole of travel, trivia, and information, I believe he's listed number 3. And again, this guy is hardcore, meaning, traveling on a real limited budget, picking up random jobs, traveling wherever he goes, living in churches and Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines. Um, 2 quick anecdotes. I don't that my details might be off a little bit, but I mean, at one point it might have been Peru. He was working, I believe, basically in a whorehouse as security, and he told a story of like shooting off his weapon one evening to protect the people there. I mean, I thought that was pretty insane. The second thing is he left Pakistan during I think it was the Afghan Russian war in the 80s, and was trying to walk back to Spain. He didn't have enough money to fly. He entered Afghanistan illegally. He didn't have a visa. And at one point got caught. I can't remember the exact number, but let's say he spent 3 months in an Afghan jail. So again, I'm, a pretty passionate traveler, and there's people that are doing and pursuing things which are, in my opinion, absolute next level.
I bet it's fair to say that a lot of the people that have done the Chasing 193, they might have entered a few of those countries illegally.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, definitely. I don't know the stats on that. Um, there's people who have entered in countries like Jorge did. A lot more have done, I would say, the dance or step over the border. So, I mean, this might be another controversial topic within our community. What counts as visiting a country? So, if you're holding your phone and you got Google Maps, um, for instance, I was in Tajikistan and I'm driving down, I think it's the Pamir River, which borders Afghanistan and Tajikistan. And at one point, I mean, I'm like, oh, I'm like so close to Afghanistan. I told my driver to stop, and I literally waded across this river until I saw on Google Maps that I was in Afghanistan. Now, for me, that was an amusing little travel anecdote. I did not count that as visiting Afghanistan. But I mean, I was in Afghanistan, but I did not count that. But there's some people in the travel community who will color in their map and go, oh, I've been to X because I stepped over the border, whether they had a visa or not.
Yeah, I definitely don't think you need a visa. I think it's okay to enter like however you can get in, I guess. Um, yeah, is stepping foot on the riverbank for 5 minutes, does that count? I guess. I don't know.
Well, I'll give you one other example of a guy who's, incredible in my books. Graham Hughes. He's a British traveler, and I don't know if it was 10 years ago, but a number of years ago, he set out to visit every country in the world without flying. Um, and more than once, he would tap his foot over the border, and he would have his little, GPS, and he would click off the, take a photo of him on his GPS device being in another country and count that. Obviously, you do that, you're not benefiting from having some rich travel experience. You don't have any stories or experiences when you do that. On the other side of the coin, he did some crazy things. Like he went basically from Senegal to Cape Verde. So Cape Verde is an island, uh, I think a couple of days by boat from Senegal. And he went in an open air wooden boat across the ocean to get to Cape Verde because, again, he will not use an airplane. He gets to Cape Verde and they arrest him for illegally entering the country. So he spent 5 nights in the Cape Verdean jail on his quest to visit every country in the world without flying. So great travel story there. Not one that I would want to duplicate, but that shows you both sides of the coins of entering a country without a visa, tapping your foot over the border, and then having a crazy experience where you end up in jail for 5 days.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I read about you that I thought was interesting was you're from Boston, but at least up to a few years ago, you'd never been to Ireland.
Yeah, especially when you realize I also went to Boston College, right? So
Mm-hmm.
BC has, I think a history of, it's a Jesuit institution, and there's a lot of Irish Catholics who have walked through the doors of my university. Yeah, so I have 4 countries left in Europe: San Marino, Cyprus, Malta, and then the big one is Ireland. And at this point, or the last several years, I've been saving Ireland to be my last country. So during my interviews, I've interviewed so many people that have finished their quest in what I would say would not be the most fun or easygoing countries.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been planning at this point that I've been holding that one back, and I thought that would be hopefully when I finish, hopefully that will be an amazing way to end my quest.
I agree with that. I think you do want to have 193 be a fun country where at least some friends and family can come meet you. It's not an insane visa thing, and you can have a in the case of Ireland, you can have a nice pint of Guinness.
Exactly. Yeah. Because I've had people I've interviewed, they ended in Central African Republic, and it's just, I mean, I think they would agree.
Anticlimactic.
Yeah, it's not the most festive of settings necessarily. So, I mean, one great example is Johnny Ward. Johnny, an Irishman, a great traveler in his own right. He had 2 countries left: Yemen and Norway. And he tried to get into Yemen multiple times, several plus times. He couldn't get in. He eventually hitched a ride on an Indian trawler going from Oman to Socotra, entered Yemen illegally. He had a great visit because Socotra is a beautiful island. Um, but he held back Norway because after he finished Yemen and checked that box, shortly after he went to Norway, his mother came, his girlfriend came, some of his friends were able to join him. No one else was going to jump on an Indian trawler to Socotra to celebrate his 193rd country.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like the play. I don't know if you know Mark Zolo. He's an Irish traveler and adventurer. And for his 100th country, if I remember this correctly, he did Iceland
Mm.
for number 100. And so, you got everyone together. You go to the ice bar and do some shots and
Mm.
stuff like that. Much better that way, I feel.
Yeah, I like his spirit, and I think that's a great 100th.
Hmm. I thought maybe we could get into some of your kind of favorite cities, favorite countries, etc. I noticed that on your top 3 cities was actually Rio de Janeiro. I was surprised to see such a touristic city
Mm.
and even a Latin American city at all make the list.
Yeah, I've been to every country in South America besides Suriname and Guyana. I love that continent. I think that continent offers so much for travelers. In the same way, I need to personally spend a lot more time there. So, um, Brazil, obviously, a humongous country with 200 million plus people. I've been there twice, but my
Mhm.
travels are not deep. My first visit was in 2002, Rio and Iguazu Falls. I went with
Mhm.
two of my buddies from Boston College. And did I have an unbelievably awesome time? I did, but it wasn't a very deep traveler's trip. It was going out to dinner and going to the bars every night. And I love that city. It's incredibly beautiful and picturesque. The beaches are awesome. The people are awesome. I went back probably in 2008 after that with my girlfriend at the time, totally different trip. We did Rio again. We went up to what is it? What's the beach called? Uh, there's a beach like an hour north of Rio that's escaping my memory right now.
Buzios,
Buzios, thank you.
Ahelbucaba.
Yeah, yeah. So again, same thing. It wasn't a very deep trip in terms of exploration. It was it was actually for New Year's Eve. Is going
Oh,
to
that's a fun one.
restaurants, hitting the top, Sugarloaf and Christos, and then relaxing on the beach. So, love that city. I hope to go back again, but I also want to go much, much deeper traveling within Brazil.
I was going to ask you which Latin American countries you might be missing, and for most people, it really is that northern South America, Guyana, Suriname, French Guyana.
Yep.
Um, Maybe we can do it together.
Yeah. It's coming down. I'm going to be going sooner than later. So, yeah, it'd be great to hook up.
And how would you? I'm trying to think what would be a good segue here. Um, Other than Rio, what have been some of your favorite cities or countries in Latin America? And do you have any kind of anecdotes that you'd want to share?
Well, I would say I love them all. I think all of them are so rich. Um, I'll give you two examples of places I love, and I mean, I think these are total bucket list trips for virtually everybody. But for me, even though I had really high expectations, it met them and went beyond. So my two examples here in this category would be Easter Island and Galapagos. Um,
Mm.
I think everybody knows those names. I mean, they're relatively remote. They both can be relatively expensive. I spent 4 nights in Easter Island. I could have done another 4 nights. I love the vibe there. It's so low key. Rented a car. I love the history there. The statues. I just, I'm a photographer. So sunrise, sunset, it was a fantastic experience. I stayed in Lemu Lodge, Lemu. I met the owner, JR. He's an awesome guy, and that was a great place to set up base. So the experience was just so rich, so fantastic. The history, also the nature is beautiful. The volcano there, Ranu, right next to the airport,
Mhm.
amazing at sunrise. So love Easter Island. Um, Galapagos, same thing. I went on a cruise with my father, which was awesome experience. Stayed on a great boat, Celebrity X. Great service. They took such great care, and there were 6 days, 2 visits a day of visiting different islands, zodiac snorkeling, and as everybody knows, the flora, the fauna, the wildlife, it's stunning and unparalleled in so many different ways. So, two of my truly favorite South American experiences that I've had.
One thing I noticed about the way in which you travel is it's actually a very active form of travel. You enjoy renting a car, going over land. You've done a couple like long distance races, even. Um, it's a very different experience to be driving around and being on the move within the country versus chilling in a city or even a small town and just sort of staying there and taking it slow. How do you think about that?
I agree with that. I would also say, I can't pigeonhole myself into one category, meaning, yeah, I've participated in two races where I personally drive a tuk tuk for 2,000 kilometers across India, and there's nothing relaxing about that adventure. I mean, it's incredibly stressful and challenging, but also so amazingly rewarding and awesome. And in the same light, I've been to the Maldives twice where you do nothing but lie on the beach and eat and drink. And, I loved that experience just as much. But yeah, I mean, renting a car and driving around is, it gives you that ultimate flexibility. Um, you're not on a set schedule. If you want to extend your trip by a day or 5 days, if you want to visit something at sunrise or sunset, you just have that flexibility. And that is priceless to be able to have that opportunity.
Have you done any overlanding or long bus trips in Latin America?
Yep. So great example. I was thinking of this when you asked the question. I don't think I've ever rented a car in South America. I was just in Saudi Arabia in November and I rented a car for 2 weeks and drove like 2,500 kilometers. Um, so yeah, I've not done any road trips. I mean, I could see myself doing like renting a car in Argentina and driving around there would be incredible. But yeah, I have not done a long road trip.
I have noticed that you do go into the interior of the countries. I read some of the blog posts where you did from Tikal and Copan, which are still on my list to do. What's your experience been in Central America?
Yeah, Central America, same thing. I've been to all those countries. I've had some great experiences. In short, I need to go back. Yeah, but visiting Tikal or going to Guatemala and for the Mayan ruins there. I think these are all underrated countries with a lot to offer. Great price points, um, good food, good people. Yeah, I love those countries. I had a great trip in El Salvador. I had a driver in a car, and got to what was it? Did like the flower garden route. Went to Sushi Ito. I can't not even remembering the name correctly, but yeah, it's underrated. Central America, great region.
And another Boston connection here is that I've recently been reading a lot about how a lot of the rediscovery of the Mayan world was really done by Harvard and Yale and the professors there, done with the financial backing of the universities. And I'm not sure if you've been to the Peabody Museum on the Harvard campus, but it's actually basically the largest collection of Mesoamerican artifacts, uh, probably in the world.
Um, I didn't know that. I haven't been, and now I feel guilty. And that's a great example of living somewhere or being from somewhere and missing out on all of your awesome backyard opportunities because you don't explore where you're from. But I'll add that to my list when I get back.
And I know it's been a while, but do you have any favorite beaches in Boston?
Yeah, well, I actually go to the U.S. twice a year, one time during the summer. So I usually make it to Cape Cod to Chatham on the Cape, and I also go to Newport, Rhode Island. So um, I love those two areas in the summer. I'll be kind of a beach snob. I mean, the reality is, if you've traveled around a bit, I mean, New England beaches are nice, but they're not going to compare to a Thai or Indonesian beach. So, I don't really, I enjoy the beaches in New England, but they don't really hold a candle to some of the others I've been fortunate enough to swim in.
It's true, but there is something about the vibe of Cape Cod that's quite unique. You know,
100%.
you kind of feel like you're JFK or something. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, no,
do
no,
you
it's awesome.
do you like think of yourself in sort of that vein of like New England adventure travelers, or like do you think about Paul Theroux, or like how? And kind of a related question, like how much do you read about uh, like history in general, and do you read about like the Victorian travelers, be it, you know, you're obviously big on Africa and the Middle East. Do you think about, you know, Sir Richard Francis Burton, Livingstone, Speke, people like that?
Yeah, so I mean, great question, and I think back to one of your earlier questions, it's like, hey, what's the motivation for chasing 193 or visiting these places? And yeah, I mean, I'm a poli sci major. I enjoy history. I enjoy politics. I love to, you know, understand and learn a little bit more when I visit the country. So with that in mind, I have another list I'm working on, and that is I'm trying to read at least one book for every country I go to. And I think if you find a great book and you're able to read that before your visit, that makes your visit so much more rewarding. Maybe you'll understand the country or the history a little bit better, and maybe some of the places that you visit tie into the book that you read, giving those places a little bit more meaning. Really quick example is I read the incredible biography on Peter the Great from Russia. It's like a 800-page book. It's a biography, but it reads like a novel. And when I went to St. Petersburg for 2 weeks, that city came alive. Being able to, take the context out of the book and apply that to what I was seeing during my visit.
Definitely. Yeah, I've read a bit about it too. It's like St. Petersburg was a completely just idea of his, and a lot of people were originally against it. And it took a lot of financing and a lot of like political effort to get the city created, but it's grown into one of the great cities.
Yeah, I mean, it was just a swamp. Hopefully I won't get this wrong. I think it was in, the year 1700 or so, and Moscow was the capital. And Peter the Great says, "We want to be closer to Europe. We're going to build this new city on the Baltic, and it's an incredibly beautiful, great city." So, thank you, Peter.
So, question about cities and setting up bases. You know, it, especially among, you know, some of the most traveled people in the world, what are you seeing in terms of people that either, when it's all said and done, they basically want to go back to their home country or hometown? You know, you just interviewed Drew Binsky, and I found it kind of curious that he bought a house in Arizona, of all places, versus people like maybe yourself, who's set up in Bangkok, literally on the other side of the planet. How do you think about what makes sense for you as a base, and what do you see among people with such great perspective on the world?
Good question. I mean, I came out to Thailand after I read a book, so that would be a good example. I read this book about an American priest who moved here in the 1970s and started this, tiny outreach program in the slums of Bangkok, which grew into this massive program helping tens of thousands of Thais. And I said to myself, I'm going to go there this winter, being 2012, escape the Chicago winter where I was living, and I'm going to live there for the winter and volunteer for this guy. So that's what opened the door for me. I mean, I love Bangkok because it's a mix of East and West. It's a mix of developed and undeveloped. I like it for the price point. It's relatively cheaper than back in Boston or Chicago. And it's just a fascinating place to live. There is great Thai people who are friendly and warm. There's an incredible expat community where you can meet like these amazing, smart and talented people. And you have this country, which, even sort of living here, I've not seen enough, but it's an incredibly diverse country with mountains in the north and islands in the south. So for me, this was a great place to set up my home base. I mean, the biggest negative is that I'm so far from the US. So, it's a pain in the butt to fly home or back and forth. But beyond that, I think it's a great home base.
And do you think that most travelers sort of feel the calling to go home? Or it's just funny when, these people kind of by definition have been to like every city in the world. And then, it's like where to decide. It's like, it's almost, what's it called? Paradox of choice in terms of where to set up because every place is awesome, or you kind of
Hmm.
have a lot of different feels for things.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think that is a challenge. Meaning, I sort of say to myself, I wish there were like 10 of me because even, I just got back from 2 months of Africa, which was awesome. But at the same time, I'm missing Bangkok and I'm missing Boston. And I'm also wishing that I was in another country exploring that. So even though my time is, quite flexible, every day I feel like there's not enough days in the week and I'm missing out on one great opportunity after another. So it's frustrating. Yeah. So I mean, sometimes I'm like, oh, I would love to live in, one of my good friends lives in, no, I can't pronounce it, in Mexico, in Oaxaca. I
Oaxaca,
haven't
yeah.
been there yet. And, I talk to him once a week or once every 2 weeks, and I keep on telling him I'm going to visit him. And he tells me how great it is. And I'm like, wow, that would be a great place to live, right? It's another fascinating country that's so rich and diverse, closer to the U.S. Great food, great people. So yeah, there's just not enough time in the day.
It's a good point. And how do you think about language learning? If it was me and I was going to travel to every country in the world, I would definitely become basically fluent in Russian, fluent in Arabic. I am fluent in French. But basically, these kind of languages where you really get your money's worth in terms of, they're the official language in 20 plus countries. I think it's weird when someone's done all 193 and they still basically only speak English except just a couple basic phrases and stuff. How big of a part does language learning play for you and for the broader community?
Another great question. I mean, and those are great language choices you've made, obviously. I mean, Russian, Arabic, French, and of course, Spanish. You would get so much utility from that. Um, I would say I'm pretty poor language facility. I speak Thai and I speak Armenian. Uh, Thai is a great language if you're in Thailand, and as you realize, it's not that useful anywhere else that you go. Same thing for Armenian. I'm ethnically Armenian. I speak bad Armenian, and it's great when I'm Armenian in Armenia, but it's pretty useless otherwise. I speak, I don't even want to say speak French or Spanish. I mean, I know a bunch of words in Spanish, French, and Russian, which at times helps out a little bit. And, whether this is an excuse I'm giving you, this goes back to there's just, I mean, for me, not enough time. Like on my list, which I've never sat down to do, is to learn the Cyrillic alphabet, which is just a major plus if you're
Hmm.
traveling in CIS countries.
Hmm.
So whether I'm lazy or not enough time, that's something that's been on my list and I've never done it.
And what percentage of travelers do you think kind of make it a point to like reach proficiency?
I'm not going to be able to throw out a number. There's tons and tons of people who are just speaking English. And the reality is, virtually everywhere I've been, you're able, at one way or the other, to get by on English. Um, of course, if you're European, you're speaking most likely your native tongue plus English, and there's a good chance you have another language or two. I mean, you can say that virtually everybody I know chasing 193 who's not, from a native English speaking country is speaking their tongue plus English because, I mean, as you know, English is the lingua de franca to get around the world. So, but yeah, some people's passions and hobbies is learning multiple languages, and they've got the right mixture of natural talent and hard work where they're doing it, and they get richer experiences out of it. So yeah, I wish I had a better facility, um, like some of the other people in the community who speak 3 or 5 different languages. That's not me. I wish it was.
Fair enough. Yeah, it's well, I guess that's hopefully reassuring to people that you really can just travel the whole world in English. I do have a couple big questions for you before we sign off. Um, First one, just a fun one, but is it possible to see everything?
To see everything,
Yes.
right? I mean, so how do you define everything? So if you go back to our original debate a little bit earlier, old school, new school, the guys who fly in for 1 or 2 nights, have they seen everything? I mean, they've been to the country, they had a meal, they probably slept over, they maybe saw a museum or something. Does that count? There's one gentleman I interviewed on my podcast, Counting Countries. He's an older German individual, Frank Gossi. Now his last name's escaping me, but Frank Gossi something. He's an engineer, like old school German engineer, and I think he's probably in his 70s. And everybody's debating, right? Is it visiting every state? Is it visiting every city over 1 million people? How do you define it? So what this gentleman did is he created an Excel spreadsheet of 5,000 places in the world. So there's
Spreadsheet of
about
everything.
a spreadsheet of everything. So to put that into context, UNESCO World Heritage Sites, there's give or
Yeah.
take 1,000, probably 1,100 World Heritage Sites around the world.
Hmm.
This guy's list is 5x of that. So when I interviewed him, he didn't say he was the most traveled, but he said he was the most he was the best quality traveled person in the world. So that's how he defined it using this 5,000 person list. You mentioned Nomad Mania a couple of times. The founder of that is Harry Mitsidzis.
Hmm.
There's 1,301 regions on that list. I think he's about 70 away. Um,
Insane.
so maybe he considers himself at some level, seeing everything because he's been to every one of these regions.
And who is the
But
person with the spreadsheet of everything?
Frank Gossi Austinghouse.
Okay. Maybe we can add that to the show notes.
Yeah, he was an interesting individual. He had a partner, and I mean, one of those other things that kind of stands out. He told me 1 year of travel, he and his partner spent $1 million. So you mentioned Jorge Sanchez,
Hmm.
who probably, over his career might have been on $5 or $10 a day. These two did 7 figures in 1 year in their pursuit of the highest quality travel.
Highest quality travel. I think it would be like I'm sure a lot of people have thought that it would be cool to visit every UNESCO or World Heritage site, and arguably it's almost like a better metric than some of the other ones. Though I've also seen that it's quite biased towards Europe. Um, So nothing's perfect.
Yeah. I think I mean, I mean, it's both a good benchmark and a poor benchmark. I mean, you hit it on the nail. You need to have money to have a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So I don't know the exact numbers, but Germany has 80 and Nigeria has one, so something like that. So if you're only utilizing that list, you're going to be missing out on giant parts of the developing world. And then the other challenge with the UNESCO World Heritage Site, give or take, I think it's 1,100. But every year they're
They're
adding
adding
in
more.
20, 30, 40, like a year. So
Right.
that's a tough list to finish. My understanding is no one has finished that list. And just to add on, like one thing, I don't even remember the name of it, but I was in Burkina Faso, in West Africa, and I think they probably have a couple of UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And I went to visit one of them. I can't even remember the name. It was basically an old kingdom in the jungle. All that was left are a couple of walls of the palace or the kingdom. But
Hmm.
it was like, it was a 5 hour drive to get there. So, you drove there 5 hours. I was the only person there. I mean,
For some
the
walls.
guide who operates the heritage site wasn't even there. We had to wait for him to show up, and it's in the middle of nowhere. So yeah, I mean, UNESCO
Kind of like
World Heritage
Timbuktu.
sites can be they can be a great catalyst to get you to corners of the country. Because if you go to Burkina Faso, you're like, oh, I'm going to go to the capital, Ouagadougou, for 2 nights. Um, Going to that UNESCO World Heritage sites forces you into more remote corners of the country where you get to see a little bit more.
That's definitely a good point. And kind of speaking to not only the financial aspect, but I had a larger question just about sacrifice. And I think there's no doubt that it's definitely a sacrifice to chase the 193. To travel in general is a bit of a sacrifice. That's opportunity cost of time that you could be spending with your family at home. How do you think about the sacrifice? What's your suggestions for other people? Do you give them advice when someone says, I want to chase the 193? Do you give them advice about, look, man, it's going to be a big sacrifice? Or how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, and another excellent question, and that's actually one question I usually ask everybody on my podcast. I mean, there's a trade off, right? You, obviously, I'm guessing this is the same for you. The vast majority of my friends live a much more traditional life. They have a home. They, drive their car to work or take their train to work, and they're home every night or home on the weekends. They're seeing family and friends, and they have a routine. Yeah, if you're chasing 193, I think you have somewhat of an outlier life. And like everything, it's a trade off, and it's at the end of the day what you desire, what you want, and what fulfills you. So yeah, you have to consider the time that you're going to have to dedicate to pursuing this goal. You're going to have to realize or anticipate the money that you're investing in spending this. um and I don't want to sound like I'm complaining, because I'm so lucky, I'm so fortunate that I've had these so many diverse and rich and amazing travel experiences. But I just did 2 months in West Africa and Central Africa, and it's exhausting and challenging. And I was relieved to fly back home to Bangkok. So it's not like you are staying in a 5-star resort every night and going to 5-star dinners and at the
Mhm.
beach. It's an incredible grind at times where you're going over the worst roads for hours. It's 100 degrees or 40 Celsius. You're eating peanuts for dinner. You're sleeping in an awful hotel with a couple of rats. So yeah, you have to take short answer, you gotta weigh the pros and cons and what matters, what's going to fulfill you personally, and then make that decision.
And if anyone was wondering what the noise was listening to this, I mean, it's 8 in the morning here, so it's coffee time basically.
Uh,
And so we're doing this podcast, by the way, for everyone with 13 hours time difference. You in Bangkok, me in Guadalajara. Kind of speaks to this globalized world. And kind of speaking of globalization a bit, I thought this would be kind of a good kind of last major theme. You definitely have a pretty interesting perspective on, the world at large and kind of what trends we're seeing and kind of where everything's going. I mean, do you have any? It's kind of a broad question. I'll narrow it down, but in the broadest sense, do you have any theories about where things are going?
that's a very broad question, so I'm going to ask you to refine it. Do you mean like in the world in general, or in travel, or I don't narrow
Sure. I
that down for
mean,
me a little bit.
yeah, I'll narrow it down. I think one of the big themes that we're talking about now, well, for context, it's, March 2022. And, every year we're kind of seeing kind of the rise of Asia, the rise of China, uh, the increased sort of um, importance of other players on the global scale, where it's not just the American hegemony and the sort of like American European thing, and we're going to a much sort of more inclusive world, a much more globalized world, a world where Asia is playing a bigger part or even quote unquote taking over. You're based in Asia right now. Um, what are you seeing in terms of that? Do you feel pessimistic about the situation that the U.S. and Europe is in? Um, are you optimistic?
Mm. Yeah, I mean that's this is a pretty challenging question. I don't really have a concise answer for that. I mean, this is an incredibly complex and global world that we're living in. I mean, the last couple of years, I mean, we have two things. I mean, they're probably not black swan events, but they feel like black swan. I mean, we've had the pandemic that changed everything in our world, and then the invasion of Ukraine by Russia also. We've had 30 years of stability and peace in general for the world, which has allowed this global connectivity, and connecting the world together, whether it's through trade, through internet. And I think a lot of that is at risk. I mean, China, which is a juggernaut, but I mean, they might be closing. The trend for them is closing themselves off from the rest of the world. I mean, are they going to be in a bubble developing on their own? How does the invasion change everything in Europe and the world at a larger level? And the pandemic, I mean, that also changed things significantly. So I mean, I don't know if I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I guess I would say I'm a realist. I would say I'm concerned. Um, and I could give you prediction. It's not going to be correct, but yeah, I think there's just so many moving parts and so many variables, that I'm concerned about. What's going to happen in the near future.
Is you basing yourself in Asia, in part to position yourself and maybe the lives of your children and future family, um, so that they understand Asia, that they're sort of more exposed to that part of the world, which seems to be growing?
No, I'm not that wise where I did a strategic move like that. Um, yeah, I mean, me moving here initially was reading that book and escaping winter. My business is actually real estate investing, but it's in the US. Um, yeah, so it's I'm not some great forward thinker who is doing the great pivot to Asia and changing his business because of the growth in this region. So, but that would make sense if I did do that, but that wasn't that's not how it worked out for me.
One of my big inspirations was Jim Rogers, who you
Yeah,
might
I
be
was
familiar
thinking
with,
about him.
the
Yeah,
author of Investment Biker and Adventure Capitalist, who famously broke some world records for traveling the world in a yellow Mercedes. And also on motorbike, was one of the first people to drive through China when it opened up in the 80s or late 70s. Really done some extraordinary things. He was basically a Wall Street banker. He worked with George Soros to break the Bank of England and do other kind of legendary things in the hedge fund space early on. And then he gave it all up and decided to travel the world, and then also famously moved to Singapore so that his children could learn Asia and learn Chinese. And I've seen videos of his two daughters, cute little like blonde girls who speak perfect Mandarin. They've been on TV in China in these sort of like learn Mandarin campaigns. And so he famously said, you know, I think it was, if you were smart in 1800, you'd move to London, in 1900 to New York, and in 2000 to China. Um, and so he thinks it's, the Chinese century, which kind of seems to be becoming more and more true every year, and Asia at large. Have you ever met Jim Rogers?
no, but yeah, I really was thinking of him when you asked me that question. I've read at least one of his book, I think Investment Biker. And I was tweeting to him somewhat recently, like last year, because I wanted to get him on my podcast. So I didn't have any success. But yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with his logic, right? Or what you just said. I mean, London, New York, Beijing. I mean, there's a very, very strong argument to be made that, yeah, I mean, that will be the center of the world. And if you can speak Mandarin and English, I mean, I think you're off to the races.
Mm-hmm. And I would be interested to hear your predictions about how you think things are going to go. I mean, you're someone that spent a lot of time in Africa on the ground, in the Middle East and in Central Asia. Are you bullish on Africa? Do you think Africa is going to play a bigger role in the world economy?
So I feel bad about kind of saying this. So you're saying, am I bullish on Africa?
Hmm.
On paper, there's a lot of upside and opportunity. I mean, it's a giant continent, tons of natural resources, a younger population. There's a lot of hope, but I've done multiple trips and spent probably a combined couple years traveling Africa. After spending my recent trip, I would say I'm sort of pessimistic. And my my takeaway motto after this most recent trip is what sums up kind of the attitude is nothing matters. So, and it's just, it doesn't matter if you're given the wrong information or charge the wrong price, or if the shower doesn't work, or the internet doesn't work, or the car doesn't work, or the bus leaves 3 hours. The general prevailing attitude seems to be nothing matters. And that worries me for the future development of the region, for the people, for their success, for increasing, their standard of living. It just, in some ways doesn't look hopeful.
It must have been a breath of fresh air after traveling overland through West Africa and then to be back in Asia where everything's efficient, the trains run on time, people highly value education. Uh, did it feel that way?
You, I mean, what you said, I think, sums up East Asia a little bit more aptly. I mean, Thailand still has a lot of that. But yeah, I mean, I have to, leaving Cameroon and flying back to Bangkok, it was a model of efficiency uh, when I got back here. I mean, comparatively, everything works. Like, I mean, I was in Freetown, Sierra Leone, and where I'm utilizing my ATM card. I had to go to 12 ATM machines because they didn't work. And then when you get to the one that works, the withdrawal is capped at $40. So for most of my time in Sierra Leone, I never had enough money. So you can't use credit cards there in general. And I didn't have enough cash because the ATMs wouldn't work. And if they did work, I was capped at $40 withdrawals. So flying back to Bangkok and arriving at the airport, and it just was so much more efficient and, to be honest, just so easy and pleasant.
Okay. So Africa sounds like Africa. How do you think about the sort of like America versus or west, East versus West dichotomy, or at least it seems to be a dichotomy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the West, and especially the U.S. I mean, it's individual freedoms, um, and democracy. When you get to the East, I mean, it's more of the collective. It's making a sacrifice for the greater good, which you could see that taking place during the early parts of the pandemic, where people would sacrifice for the greater good of their family or their neighborhood or their community or the city. And we,
Mhm.
unfortunately, didn't have that as much in the U.S. So, I mean, there's the stereotypes of, you know, more focus on education. I forget what the numbers are. It's like China or India graduate, 100x engineers more than the U.S., where the U.S., the number one popular major in the U.S. is like physical therapy. So, I mean, there's a bit of a different mindset when it comes to, I think, education and what their values are, family over the individual and the collective compared to individual freedom. So those are, I think, some of the differences that I see.
What advice would you have for a young person, maybe someone at Boston College right now, or a young person thinking about how they want to spend their 20s or how they want to focus their career, what they want to dedicate themselves to, what's a worthwhile purpose? Um, I bet as someone so widely traveled, what you really learn probably is humility and to not give advice. But do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was going to say, don't listen to me or don't do what I did. I mean, if you're going back to BC, I mean, one of the, I think, biggest mistakes I did was majoring in political science, which to me has really limited value. So if I'd gone back in time, I wish I learned more of a hard skill. I don't, whether that's accounting or nursing or engineering, something of that nature. Um, so, I mean, I think that gives you really a much more of a competitive stance when you're going out into the job market. I mean, obviously, I would give some advice on travel and what that means. Um, whether that's a semester abroad to go overseas, whether it's, the year after you graduate. I mean, I would really encourage anybody, I don't care if you're 20 or 30, to figure out somehow to go overseas, to block off whether it's 3 months or 12 months, I think that's really one of the most rewarding experiences you can have, because that gives you really a deeper experience. One, you're embedded with locals. For I volunteered at an orphanage in Phuket, and I'm working with Thai people, not other foreigners, and I'm working with Thai kids, and you're learning about the culture, the language, seeing how they live, and it's one it's one of those things you get back much more than you give. So I think that would be my biggest piece of advice. Figure out how to break off 3, 6, 12 months of your life and get overseas somewhere, where
Hmm.
you can embed in the community and volunteer.
I agree. I think it gives you actually even a greater perspective on where you're from and your home country by doing so.
100%. 100%.
Do you think that travel and chasing the 193 has gotten way more difficult in this post-COVID world? Lots of new travel restrictions. Is it making it harder for new people who want to accomplish it to get it done?
110%. I don't know the numbers exactly, but this anecdotally will prove the point. Back to Nomad Mania, they track the people who complete the goal of visiting every country by calendar year. So 2019 was the high point for all time. There's something like 40 plus people completed the goal of visiting every country in the world.
Hmm.
Um, 2020, 2021, let's say it was 6 people each year. So a dramatic fall off from 2019. So yeah, it's incredibly difficult and that much more challenging, post or current COVID, to travel in general everywhere. It's no, the rules constantly change. It's gotten more expensive. It's the rules are changing. It's frustrating, and it's hypothetically risky on a couple of different levels. I mean, I know people who've been sick and put in intensive care when traveling overseas who got COVID. I've known
Hmm.
people who are trying to fly out of a country and they do the PCR test to board the plane, and next thing you know, they're in a hospital quarantine for 2 weeks in Tajikistan because they tested positive and they're not allowed to leave the country. So that costs you hundreds or thousands of dollars. It screws up all of your upcoming plans. So you have to be extra motivated, do extra planning and logistics, and be a little bit fearless to get back on the road during the pandemic.
Hmm. And so, what would be the most difficult regions of the world in order to get this done? If I had to guess, the Caribbean is a little tricky just because there's no flights between places, and you basically just have to keep flying back and forth to Panama or Miami. Africa is obviously super difficult for primarily for the visa issue and how almost nothing is visa on arrival. And then I imagine, what do you call it? Like sort of the South Pacific Islands, like Vanuatu and all that are probably a bit difficult as well, just in terms of kind of long flights. And I don't know. I don't even know how you do that region. Like you just keep flying back and forth to Australia or something, or Southeast Asia. Yeah, what's up with that?
Yeah, so I'll start off with Pacific, and that's definitely one of the more challenging areas of the globe. And I would say it's challenging for cost and logistics. Like you said, it's not like taking the shuttle from Boston to New York where it leaves on the hour, right? So if you want to get to some of these islands, there might only be 2 flights a week. So you have to reverse engineer and figure out everything. One of the popular hubs actually in that region is Fiji, so that can get you to a bunch of those Pacific islands. Um, so yeah, Pacific is challenging from a cost and logistics standpoint. Caribbean, I mean, I mean, same thing. I mean, there's not a ton of great flight options, but it's multifold easier than the Pacific Islands. I would say
Okay.
in general, Africa is the most challenging. Um, Visas, visas are tough or expensive. I'll give you two quick examples. I mean, I have to get visas for Nigeria and Cameroon. Some of these countries have hacks or workarounds. So technically, Nigeria, you have to send your passport to the Nigerian embassy in Washington D.C. Probably costs close to $200 plus the FedEx to get that visa. I was already in Africa when I added Nigeria onto my trip. So there's a workaround. The workaround is you can get a business visa, and the business visa is an e-visa, so you don't have to send your passport anywhere. The problem is it's $300. So that's a good little chunk of change. My Cameroon business visa was $420. So yeah, visas, no, a lot of bad flights between the countries are incredibly expensive. Tough driving around, tough land border crossings, not as much information about most of those countries. So yeah, Africa is probably the hardest, with West Africa and Central Africa even more so.
Hmm. And I think what's tough about a lot of the visas is they want you to go back to your home country to apply, and you have to apply to your home country, which is like an enormous barrier for most people, right? But in most
100,
cases, there's a workaround.
100%. They might have a general rule. Some are harder, some are softer. Like Algeria, I'm pretty sure I really don't hear any workarounds for Algeria, meaning you need to get your passport to the embassy in your home country. Um, but yeah, so for instance, I was going to Guinea Bissau. So there's a well known hack in southern Senegal. There's a town, which I'm going to pronounce incorrectly, Ziguinchor, and there's a consulate for Guinea-Bissau, and it's kind of well known in the 193 community, and you hope it's as good as you read. So what I read, multiple data points, is you go up to this consulate, walk in, and you come out with your Guinea-Bissau visa in 20 minutes. And that was the case. Me and my friend went in, and in 10 minutes, I think for $25 each, we had a beautiful Guinea Bissau visa in our passports. Now, the X factor is the council is away on business for the day or the week, or he's sick.
Mm.
And then you have a giant monkey wrench in your plan. But in that example, it was quite simple and straightforward and painless to get that visa.
I think I've also read that a lot of the embassies or consulates are in Morocco, and maybe, I don't know, I'm guessing in like Egypt or South Africa, and a lot of people just have to keep going back and forth to Morocco to get these like African visas.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's another great point you're bringing up. There's some hubs, like Dakar's pretty good where you can get a bunch of visas. But again, here's the flip side. I went to Abuja, Nigeria. That's the capital. And I had a guide, and I called up WhatsApp my guide. I'm like, hey, I need to get the Cameroon visa in Abuja. He's like, okay, we're going to call for you. And he messages me back. He's like, you're all set. The visa's open. The consulate, the embassy's open. They'll process your visa. No problem. So the first day I get to Abuja, we drive to the embassy and I knock on the door. It's a small building. And I walk into the little guard post and they're like, oh, we're not issuing visas today. I'm like, what do you mean? We're not issuing visas. You can come back tomorrow. And I'm like, well, how long does it take to process it? They're like, 2 days. And I'm like, well, I'm going to be gone in a day. They're like, oh, you can get someone to pick it up for you. I'm like, oh, great. How do I do that? They're like, oh, you got to go to the police station and fill out a couple of forms to authorize a person. So in other words, that's a great example. You're planning a trip, but nothing is necessarily concrete. So you, in your mind, you're like, oh, I'm going to get this visa in one day and continue on my trip. So I had two options. I could have changed my entire 2 week itinerary to double my time in Abuja to get this visa, or what I did is I ended up getting the business visa for double the price and then was able to explore the country and continue on with my itinerary within Nigeria.
Makes sense. This is kind of a random question, but this is the image that's like conjured in my mind is they're often, you like to think that these embassies are in like grand buildings with pillars and stuff, but they're often just in like a random, like nondescript office building, I find. And I can just picture you or the 193 guys, and they're just kind of like sitting in like a little like plastic chair, and there's a guy with like kind of like an army outfit and a beret hat, and they're all just really like staring at you, and it's just kind of awkward, or like, you know what I mean? There was like lots of like movie scenes like that.
And I mean, I mean, if you had asked me before I started traveling, right, you think of an embassy, you kind of think of like a castle or a fort or some really dignified building. Um, this is, I mean, this story takes place in the U.S., but it's kind of funny. I one time had to get a Thai visa in the U.S., and I ended up going to the consulate, the honorary consulate in Boston, and the honorary counsel in Boston was this Italian guy who owns the Union Oyster House in Faneuil Hall. This is, I can't remember the exact fact or trivia. This is like the oldest restaurant in America. But this guy, over 30 years, had developed a relationship with the government of Thailand. And one time they said, "Do you want to be the honorary counsel to Thailand?" He's like, "Yeah." So you went into the restaurant and went into the restaurant office, and I got my visa sticker from the owner of this restaurant.
And you actually had to go to the Union Oyster House to get it?
Yeah. Above above the restaurant was this around the corner was this steep staircase, and it brought me up to the office of the, I forget his name, um, who was the honorary counsel, and it was him and his administrative assistant. And I hung out in their office for a little bit. You know, he was a well-traveled guy in his own right, and they hooked me up with this the visa for my passport. So good people.
Maybe we'll the subtitle for this podcast will be like clam chowder and a Thai visa.
Yeah. Yeah. Boston clam chowder.
So we'll get to wrapping it up. I do think the visa stuff is really interesting, though. It's, one of the big pushes we're going to make for My Latin Life in particular is how to help people get visas and residency permits, particularly in Latin America. In my head, I mean, I bet you don't know much about this, but I bet there's just so many countries in Africa. I bet some of them do have like cool, like permanent residency programs and stuff like that. Have you heard anything like on the ground about like people getting residency permits in Africa, or even sort of like getting like an African citizenship to make the travel around Africa more visa free and easier?
That is an interesting question, and short answer is no. Like you, I have friends like you. I mean, what did you have? You have Canada, US, and you said Italy.
Hmm.
Um, so what I'm getting at is I know a lot of my friends who are striving for a second or even third passport. I just was at dinner last night, great Mexican restaurant in Bangkok with one of my friends, a very well traveled guy, Dave from Dave's Travel Corner website. Little shout out to him. And he was all excited. He just got his Luxembourg passport. So he's
Wow.
a tri citizen, US, Italy, and just picked up Luxembourg. And you make a good point. I mean, it would be helpful to have a passport from one of the West African countries that would get you into that region. I know one woman, Jessica Nabongo. Um, I think she was born in Detroit, but her family's from Uganda, so she got a Uganda passport. And then Slavik Mutari, who I interviewed, would be another example. He was born in Poland to a Polish mother and Kenyan father. So he has both the Polish and Kenyan passport. But Yeah, in short, most people I know don't haven't focused on an African residency or citizenship, but in some ways that would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, because even with residency, they have sort of like a driver's license looking card usually. And at least in Latin America, if you're like a resident of one country, you can typically, it makes it easier to travel to the other countries just by showing. Sometimes you can take flights just by showing the card and not even a passport. So maybe it would make things easier with Africa. If I was like a high end traveler who was looking to accomplish this, I would even maybe go so far as do one of those like real estate by investment slash donation programs and get like a
Mhm.
Turkish passport, or I think there's a program in Jordan, things like that. And then maybe that would open up like a lot more visa free options in Africa.
Yeah. Well, one other example that I just recalled, I have a. He's technically my driver, but I consider him my friend because we've been on like 4 road trips together. He's an interesting individual character, really great guy. Marlon, he was actually born in Suriname in South America, grew up in Holland, but 20 years ago fell in love with African drum music from Burkina Faso. So he's basically been splitting his time for the last 20 years in Holland and Burkina Faso in West Africa. He got his Burkina Faso passport, and that allows him to enter its ECOWAS, Economic Community of West Africa. I think it's like 15 countries or something like that. So that's a great example to your point of not having a hassle when driving around or visiting those countries.
Have you met any people with like four, five, six passports? Like who is the most passport person you've heard of or met?
No one's coming to mind. I mean, I can't really think of people I know really with more than 3 citizenships or 3 passports. So I'm not. No one's coming to mind 4 or 5, but that would be impressive.
Fair enough. Well, potentially a future podcast guest.
Yeah, no, yeah, we should find someone with 5 or 7 or 10. That would be it'd be an outlier individual.
hmm well, yeah, man. I think on that note, we'll wrap it up. You've been super generous with your time. Also, want to thank you again for kind of reaching out in order to get this interview organized. This has been a really, really fascinating discussion, and I'm really, really happy to have been able to have this conversation. Um, why don't we take a minute for you to again promote the Extraordinary Travel Conference and some of the other things you're working on?
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, it's been a really fun, interesting, pleasurable conversation. So thanks for having me on. I really appreciate the invite. Yeah, I mean, if you're checking me out, you can Google Global Gaz, GAZ or Z. That will take you to my blog and social media. Counting Countries is my podcast. And then if you want to meet other very, very well traveled people, check out the Extraordinary Travel Festival.com. You can buy a ticket, use code ETF, Extraordinary Travel Festival, for a discount. And feel free to reach out to me to say hi on any of my social media.
And when is the festival in Armenia?
October 14th.
October 14th in Armenia. All right, I might try to make an effort to get out there.
That would be awesome.
Awesome, Rick. Well, thank you so much for your time, and looking forward to more episodes of the Counting Countries podcast. I highly recommend everyone check that out. But yeah, thanks again.
Awesome. Thank you.